If you leave me, then I'll be afraid of everything. Written by Cadmus and Throth. Read by Arashi. Grief, Dimitri finds, does not hit him the way he thought it would, does not hit him the same way it had before. Grief, Dimitri learns, is a slow creeping that curls itself into every thought, his every breath, every movement he makes. Grief, he discovers, can be cruel in the way it seeps into his pores and winds itself into his bones, until he cannot find where he would even begin to separate himself from it. Dimitri sometimes isn't sure he wants to be rid of it at all, isn't sure he can stand to lose the thing that continues to tie him to the man he loves. No, grief is not sudden. It does not have him screaming in his sleep at night. It does not have him lashing out at everyone who dares to speak Felix's name. It presents itself in quiet ways, in the way Dimitri will turn to his right, where Felix had always stood, with his mouth open to make a comment only to find him not there, leaving an ache in his chest. It is there in the way Dimitri finds himself making meals for two when he comes home to their apartment at night, and ultimately throwing out the other portion because his heart breaks when he even considers having to eat it himself. It is there in the way that Dimitri will wake in the middle of the night, with his head curled in the empty space of their bed, just his now, reaching for a warmth that will never return home to him, pressing his hands into the mattress, as though he can feel an echo of his lover's presence. It is there where Dimitri has to squeeze his eyes shut and try not to cry when there is nothing to be found. Grief is almost gentle in how it does not retch sobs from his throat at the barest mention of what he has lost. Instead, it leaves him with tremors in his hands, because he remembers what it felt like when Felix held them, and he dreads the day that the memory fades into something he can't quite recall. Dimitri is not brought by grief to Felix's grave every day. He worships his lost lover in quieter ways, in the flowers on his counter that he replaces often, the ones Felix loved most, in the music he leaves playing softly in the background while he cleans, because it was what Felix always played when he wanted a little bit of noise, in how he continues to make Felix's favorite meals, because he can remember the way he had smiled the first time Dimitri cooked for him. Grief does not make his world go gray. It merely dulls the colors in things. It makes life a little less vibrant. Grief hollows out a place in his chest where his heart is meant to be, and it rests there, bleeding into his very soul through the emptiness he now felt, now that he was alone again. He will sit in his too quiet house sometimes, with Felix's jacket clutched to his chest, as though he imagines enough. It will feel like he's still there, even for just a moment. Grief trickles into his daily life in the ways he starts to wear Felix's cologne, just to have something similar to the scent of him around. It's not quite right, but it makes his chest ache a little less. Dimitri finds himself walking along their favorite places with the sunrise, whispering a quiet good morning to his lover, even though he is not there to hear. Sunrises had always been one of Felix's favorite things. If he were to be found anywhere, Dimitri thinks it only fitting that it be in the brilliant burning rays of the sun. Grief does not tear him apart with angry hands. It does not cut into him like a knife. Grief is a slow burning, a destruction that does not feel like the thing it is. Grief takes from him until Dimitri is unsure of who he is meant to be, when his future had been built around a man who was no longer there. Grief is something that never quite leaves him. Dimitri learns to smile again, learns to laugh. He lets go of some of the things that make him ache so fiercely, but it never really lets him go. It remains with him through all the wonderful, horrible things life brings him. Grief accompanies him when Dimitri visits Felix's grave once a week for the rest of his life. It is by his side when Dimitri tells the sunrise stories about what happened lately. It joins him when Dimitri continues to buy Felix's cologne instead of his own. Grief, Dimitri decides, is not a cruel thing. It is a constant companion in his loss. It is a reminder that once was, can be no longer. It is a reminder that he had something so very good. Grief is not kind, in that it makes his eyes burn and his body shake with silent sobs. But it is not cruel. It is merely there. It is something Dimitri learns to live with. It is something he is almost grateful for. Grief, Dimitri decides, allows him to remember what he had. It allows him to cry. Grief, Dimitri decides, so many years after the passing of the only man he has ever loved, is something of a friend. It had accompanied him through all the chaos of his life since that day, and will hold his hand until the end, when it will finally let him go. Grief, Dimitri decides, carries him to the threshold, It would hold him until the day he gets to see Felix again. It is the one thing that has never abandoned him. Grief, Dimitri decides, is something he cannot hate, not when it has loved him so well.